Why have just one subwoofer when we can have two? And why do sealed when we can do ported? We are kicking off yet another custom subwoofer enclosure build here on the channel. How can we properly measure for a custom subwoofer enclosure, and what considerations do we need to make to get the best possible subwoofer base? Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm Mark. Welcome to CarAudioFabrication. Here on this channel, together we learn how to master car audio and how to design, build, and install our dream car audio system. Let's discuss. So while I disconnect the wiring on this enclosure, first off, subwoofer selection. And to properly determine that, we need to know my goals and allowances for this particular system. First goal, of course, great sounding bass, and in this case, I really want to go with a ton of output. This means cone area is going to be important, but also a good quality subwoofer. Second goal, not needing substantial electrical upgrades. A request that I get from you guys frequently on the channel is a system that is more geared towards being a daily driver. And for that, we're going to assume that making substantial upgrades to the electrical system of the vehicle, things like upgrading the alternator, really isn't in the cards. So for this project and this application, we're going to limit the amplifier power for the subwoofers to about 1,000 watts RMS. With a properly designed enclosure and system, this is pretty substantial anyhow. Goal number 3, fit within this relatively small cargo area. This here is a Jeep Wrangler, but the process we're going to cover in this video can really be applied to any vehicle. It's just worth noting that the cargo area here isn't really the biggest thing in the world. And to limit things even more, I want the enclosure to sit below the top of the seat level here. It's always critical to consider your application before choosing a subwoofer or subwoofers. And in our case, now that we know our goals for our application, we can start to make our subwoofer selection. I think it's always a good idea to start with narrowing your subwoofer selection based on the quantity of subwoofers that you want to go with and their size. To start this process, it's always good to consider what your layout for your subwoofers is going to look like. I know that in my case here, I'm probably going to have some subwoofers next to each other. Obviously, there's space for more than one here. And if I go based off of my width here, once I take into account some of the obstructions on the floor and everything, is about 38 inches. 38 inches is a bit on the tight side for two 15s once you factor in the fact that most 15s are over 16 inches wide when you take into account the actual OD of the subwoofer. And also, not to mention that if this is ported and we want to have a nice symmetrical port, we also need to have a port between the subwoofers. And also knowing that 15s typically take up quite a bit of air volume, and the fact that I do want to have a little bit of extra storage space back here if possible, and I also want to stay below this seat line here, I think I'm going to be leaning more towards 12s, or there are some companies out there that offer 13-inch subwoofers as well. We're definitely going to verify in more detail later in the process that the subwoofer we choose is in fact going to work, but at the start of the process here, we definitely need to kind of ballpark things. So let's pick some subwoofers, and one of my favorite ways to do this is with our show sponsor, Crutchfield. On their website, we can easily narrow down subwoofers by brand, size, and even required airspace and top mount depth. We can sort by price to match our budget. We can also easily compare different subwoofer specs. And since Crutchfield has an excellent US-based tech support team, if we have any questions, we can easily reach out and get help. Even better yet, they've helped out our community with a special offer that allows you to save on your next qualifying car audio purchase. If you guys would like to learn more about that and Crutchfield, definitely check out the links down in the video description. Now, I definitely want to give you some insight on how I ended up making this decision, but we're fast forwarding a little bit here. I did ultimately decide to go with two of the JL Audio 13 W3s. Now, of course, full disclosure, JL Audio is another sponsor of our channel, but regardless, JL Audio does have a wide subwoofer line that I could have chosen from. And what I want to do here is I want to open these up and I want to get out the manual so that we can discuss more in detail things that you can research when it comes to choosing your subwoofers. So there we have it. There's our manual right there, along with some warranty information and stickers in this case. And let's just take a quick look at these bad boys. There it is, guys, the JL Audio 13 W3 -4. The -4 meaning that these are the single 4 ohm voice coil model, but let's take a closer look at our manual. Now you may be thinking, how can I possibly look at the manual for the subwoofers before I purchase them? That's another good feature of the Crutchfield website. You can easily access the manual for all the different products that they have online. So that allows us to easily access all of this detailed information. Now I have some firsthand experience with these from a build previously that we did here on the channel. And in that build that also had 2 of these, we powered the subwoofers with 400 watts RMS each. One of the things that I like that JL Audio does is they give us this power band that we should look to be within for the subwoofer, and this gives us a better explanation of the performance that we can expect within the range of the power band. So previously being in that 400 watt range was a good choice for these subwoofers, and in this case we're going with even a little bit more. Since we are using an 1000 watt RMS amplifier, we're going to have 500 watts RMS per sub. A quick side note, the amplifier that we are using is the JL Audio VX1000/1i. This is mounted on one of the amplifier racks that fits under the seat in the Wrangler. Going back to that previous build that we did here on the channel with the 2 13W3s, not only did they sound very musically accurate, they also seriously got down. The amount of thump and attack that you could feel in your chest was substantial, and that was in a sealed enclosure. I've been dying to try these in a ported enclosure ever since. So now we have the chance, but regardless, the point here is that we are going to be within our goal of being at 1000 watts RMS for the 2 subwoofers. These are actually rated up to 600 watts RMS. We're going to be well within the power band of giving 500 watts RMS to each. And again, I just really want to drive this point home because it comes up quite often. Just because a subwoofer is rated at a certain watts RMS doesn't mean that you're required to give it that full value. In fact, they explain it pretty well here. You can see the dark gray maximum, which is what we're starting to get into with the 500 watts anyhow, is just going to be slightly more SPL will be gained by pushing the power into this zone, but typically not more than 2 decibels compared to the light gray area, which is right here, which is right about 400 watts. Reliability is important too. We're going to be able to beat on this system, and it's going to be within that reliable range. Now, the other critical bit of information that we want to grab from the manual or also from the specs that are listed on Crutchfield is we want to look for a target air volume for the ported section of the enclosure, and in this case for the 13W3 V3-4, that's 2¼ cubic feet. We're of course going to double this, so we need 4½ cubic feet of air volume after all displacements, and that's critical. We're going to talk about that. This is where measuring before we make our subwoofer selections is key, and I want to go through that process with you. Now on this enclosure here, I do want to incorporate this back of the seat angle. In other words, I want the enclosure to come up tight against this seat, which means I need to actually get 2 measurements for the depth. I need to get one at the top of the seat, which I know is going to be my max height, and I also want to get one at the bottom of the seat. I like to start with the bottom, so I'm going to get a rough estimate here. And in the Jeep here, part of the door sticks out, which we can kind of see in the floor mat design here. I'm gonna go with 31 inches to know that I'm safe, and I'm going to roughly remember this spot on the floor mat here. The reason I want to roughly remember that spot is as I go up to the top of the seat, I'm going to have the tape measure resting right here now. And this is a little bit difficult to show on camera, but if we eyeball to our previous spot, we have about 24 inches of depth at the top. So we ended up with 31 inches for the bottom depth and 24 for the top. We'll of course record that on a piece of paper. And in the meantime, we already talked about this a little bit to determine the size of our subwoofers, but we want to get ourselves a width. And in this case, remember, that's our 38 inches. Our final dimension to get here is going to be our height, and we want to make sure that our height matches the point that we are measuring to when we measured that top depth. I might not have shown that clearly on camera, but in this case, it's 21 inches. Now that we have some measurements, let's do some quick math here in order to verify that we're gonna have enough air volume. So first off, we had a bottom depth of 31 inches, and we're going to subtract 24 inches, which is the top depth. We're gonna divide that by 2, and the reason we're doing this is we're going to get an average depth. So we're gonna add this back to that top measurement. Our average depth is 27.5 inches. So if you were to measure at half of the height along that angle, that's going to be your average depth. I want to be absolutely clear, we're just looking for approximations here. We're not trying to do the detailed math yet until we get into the design. So 27.5 average depth, and we're going to multiply that by our 38-inch width and our 21-inch height. This is roughly how many cubic inches we have to work with before any displacements. We're going to divide this by 1728. That is how many cubic inches are in a cubic foot. So we're basically converting to cubic feet. We have 12.7 cubic feet to work with. I do want to point out though, this is absolutely before any displacements. So this is not the air volume. This is before we take into account the displacement of the subwoofer itself, the displacement of all the materials, the displacement of the port. But I do have a number that I frequently use as an approximation in order to determine how much air volume we're going to have after all of those displacements. And I talk about how I got that number in a full other video that you guys can check out on the channel. But we're going to take that approximately 12.7 cubic feet and we're going to multiply it by 0.55. And this gives us a more average example of what we're going to have to use air volume wise, which in this case is about 7 cubic feet, which if you remember is more than our 2.25 times 2 for 2 subwoofers, our 4.5 cubic feet. So we should definitely have more than enough space to work with here, which is good because we also need to account for the fact that, remember I said I would like to keep a little bit of storage area back here behind the enclosure if possible. And another consideration, we also do want to make sure that we have some room for the port to breathe depending on which direction we are facing the port. In our case, I'm planning on doing subs up and port to the rear. Bringing all of this information together, I'm gonna get more detailed here now and design this enclosure. All right, my friends, so after spending some time on the computer here is the design that we've come up with. First off, like we talked about, subwoofers facing up and port to the rear. You'll of course also immediately notice that the back side of the enclosure is in fact angled to match that angle of the rear seat. Now feature-wise, we of course have a double layered baffle for our subwoofers. This is important because we want to add some strength back into this top surface since it has these huge cutout holes for the subwoofers themselves. And you'll also notice with those 2 layers there, one layer is cut to the internal cut ID of the subwoofer, and the other layer on top here is cut to the outer dimension in order to give this subwoofer a flush look. Now, because of this angle in the back here, the port design does get pretty complex. We're going to talk about that in just a second. A few other features though, in regards to bracing on this enclosure, these dual ports kind of act as the bracing as they are in close proximity to the cutout holes for the subwoofers. So you have each of these port walls acting as bracing along with the front and side of the enclosure being close to the cutout. Now we also have some corner 45s on the front side of the enclosure here to add some strength. And you'll notice on this enclosure, I've gone with 2 completely separate chambers with this divider through the middle. Now let's talk about this port here because this is where things get complex. If you think about it, if we look at this from the side here, technically that internal port on the inside, it's going to be shorter on the top than it is the bottom as it makes that bend. For that reason, if we look at the front here, and we're going to hide this front, we need this actual internal back port wall, the second wall there, to actually be shorter on the bottom than it is the top. And this is to account for the difference in the angle there from top to bottom. This, of course, all needs to be precisely calculated as we go through our design process. And a quick side note here, if you guys need help with a custom subwoofer enclosure design, I can definitely assist. Check out my website, CarAudioFabrication.com. It helps support the channel, and I also love working with you guys on your projects. Now, in terms of final dimensions on this enclosure here, I wanted to show you guys something important. If you remember, our top depth was 24 inches and our bottom depth was 31 inches, which is a difference of 7 inches from top to bottom. It's important to note that as long as we keep this 21-inch height the same, as long as we have a 7-inch difference between the top and bottom depth, we're always going to have this 71.6 degree angle. What I ended up finding during the design process is if I wanted to have the port kind of staged behind the subwoofer here, it was advantageous to have a little bit more top depth. Now this means that I of course could have just used more overall depth, but what I found is that if I decreased my height slightly, I would actually get a little bit more top depth to work with while still using the same bottom depth. So ultimately what I ended up doing is going with a height of 18 inches for the enclosure instead, as that gave me about an inch more to work with on that top depth. It's important to note here though that now the depth difference becomes only 6 inches between the top and the bottom, but as long as we stay at that 18-inch height and retain this 6-inch difference, we're still going to have that same angled measurement there. Now also remember that I wanted to reduce my depth slightly to have some space behind the enclosure, so rather than going with a 31-inch bottom depth, I ended up going with 23.625 inches. And remember that based on using an 18-inch height, we want that to be a 6-inch difference from top to bottom, so my top measurement should be 17.625 inches, which it is. And we can even double check and verify this angle between these two surfaces here. You can see we still have that 71.6 degrees. So to give you guys an idea how compact this enclosure is, despite being for two massive subwoofers, you can see that based on our dimensions here, we're actually saving a little over 7 inches from that rear dimension that we measured, which was actually spaced a few inches inside of the door anyway. So we're going to have a good 9 or 10 inches of gap between the back of the enclosure and our rear of our vehicle, which is great for allowing that port to breathe and having a little bit of storage space if need be. Now, of course, air volume and tuning is also extremely important. So as I went through my design process, I factored that in, of course, as well. And ultimately what I ended up coming up with is the orange graph here. Let me switch over to it. So the orange is my graph and the blue is the suggested values from JL Audio. They recommend a slightly lower port tuning. I ended up going with 4.5 cubic feet at 32 hertz instead. And I just wanted to show you guys the trade-off of that here. So I'm not going to have quite as much low-end extension below about 33 or so hertz here, 34 hertz, but I am going to have a little bit more overall output. It is worth noting here though that the difference between the max output point here, let's say that's 3.13 dB, and let's switch over, and this is at like 1.85. That's really only a difference of about 1.3 decibels, which in reality is extremely hard to hear. So this enclosure isn't being made for the meter. It's not being made to compete. Even though it's going to have a little bit more max output over the suggested values, the difference here is minimal. You would really be hard pressed to even hear the difference. Another important comparison I wanted to make though here is this vehicle has become sort of a test bench on the channel. I've tested and ran multiple different subwoofer configurations in it now, and one of the projects you guys may remember is when I did the JL Audio 13W7. That enclosure performed really well, and it was designed for 3 cubic feet at 30 hertz. And you can see here on our SPL estimation graph here, this was the approximate performance of the 13W7, and this is all based off using 1000 watts RMS. So in that case, the 1000 watts RMS was to that single subwoofer, and you can see now with our orange curve, with again 1000 watts total, so 500 watts to each subwoofer, you can see we're going to be able to expect quite a bit more output. And a quick side note here, remember that these graphs are an estimation and they are in an anechoic chamber, meaning you don't have cabin gain. So the fact that you only see 124 decibels here, trust me, it's going to be significantly louder than that once we factor in the acoustic environment of the vehicle. Back to the design. From there, I of course create my blueprint, which has all of my dimension measurements and all of the angle measurements, so I know exactly what I need to cut in order to make this enclosure. Coming up next in this video build log series, we're of course going to build this enclosure. With all the angles involved and the complex port structure, this is going to be an interesting one. We're gonna have to see if I can pull it off. If you are new here to the channel, I'd love to have you as a subscriber. And don't forget that if you would like to research car audio and save on your next qualifying purchase, definitely check out our show sponsor, Crutchfield, at the links down in the video description. A big thanks to them, along with Jerry and the Patreon membership team, for making these videos possible. And thank you guys so much for tuning in and watching.